What if you could recognize the exact moment an empath starts shutting you out emotionally, and you could understand the hidden system behind it before they completely disappear from your life? Because today you're going to learn something most people never notice. Empaths don't randomly detach. They follow a psychological sequence that runs silently in the background. And once you understand it, you stop guessing their behavior and start decoding it. Here's the part most people completely misunderstand. Empaths are not slow to react. They are slow to conclude. There's a difference. They operate on a perception versus reaction model. While most people respond to what just happened, empaths track what's consistently happening beneath the surface. They don't isolate moments. They connect patterns across time. They don't just hear words. They measure alignment. They don't just see actions. They evaluate intention. And because of this, they delay reaction. Not out of confusion, but out of precision. They're collecting data. Emotional consistency, behavioral patterns, energetic shifts. They notice what repeats. They notice what changes. And more importantly, they notice what doesn't match. And during this time, they may look calm, even accepting, unbothered, present, still engaged. But internally, they're building a psychological profile, layer by layer, interaction by interaction. One silent question runs in the background. Is this a moment or a pattern? And once that question is answered, everything accelerates. Because empaths don't need repetition once clarity is reached. They don't need confirmation once the pattern stabilizes. Their behavior changes instantly, not dramatically, but definitively. So what looks like patience is actually calculated observation, and what feels like tolerance is simply delayed detachment in progress. There is a specific moment. You won't see it, you won't hear it, but it changes everything. Pattern recognition, threshold. Before this point, the empath is interpreting. They're analyzing, adjusting, trying to understand the gaps between what's said and what's felt. After this point, they're no longer interpreting. They're seeing clearly, directly, without distortion. This is where emotional attachment loses its influence, because once a pattern becomes predictable, it stops feeling personal and starts feeling structural, something repeatable, something fixed. And structure is easier to detach from than emotion. Here's the shift. They stop asking, why is this happening? And start recognizing this is how it works. That single realization collapses confusion. It removes the need to keep analyzing, to keep questioning, to keep hoping for a different outcome. And when confusion disappears, so does emotional investment, because uncertainty creates attachment, but clarity creates distance. Once they see inconsistency as consistent effort, as conditional, presence as unstable, their brain categorizes the connection as non-viable, not temporarily flawed, but fundamentally misaligned. And once something is labeled that way, the system protects itself, not emotionally, but automatically. That's the cutoff. And once crossed, you're no longer being understood. You're being phased out. Empaths don't disappear randomly. They don't walk away on impulse, and they don't detach from single events. They respond to specific internal signals that build over time, quietly, consistently, and beneath the surface of normal interaction. 3 core triggers activate withdrawal. 1. Emotional inconsistency. Unstable presence disrupts trust faster than conflict ever could. Because it's not the disagreement that creates distance, it's unpredictability. When someone's emotional state, attention, or engagement keeps shifting without clarity, it forces the empath into a constant state of internal monitoring. And over time, that sustained alertness becomes mentally and emotionally exhausting. The nervous system starts prioritizing stability over connection. 2. Unreciprocated depth. When emotional investment isn't mirrored, they begin reducing access, not as a decision at first, but as a natural response. Because empaths don't just notice imbalance, they feel it. And when depth is consistently one-sided, the internal system begins recalibrating automatically. What was once freely given becomes selectively shared. 3. Energetic drain. When interaction consistently costs more than it gives, the nervous system flags the connection as unsustainable. This isn't emotional reaction, it's biological regulation. The body starts signaling that the exchange is no longer balanced enough to maintain. Now here's the key insight. These triggers don't create sudden reactions. They initiate recalibration. The empath starts adjusting quietly. Less emotional exposure, less availability, less internal prioritization. And this happens without announcement because they are not trying to fix the external dynamic. They are restoring internal balance. But once all three triggers are confirmed, withdrawal becomes inevitable, not dramatic, not emotional, just necessary. When an empath begins to leave, they don't disappear all at once. There is no sudden break, no visible rupture, and no single moment that defines the exit. They follow a sequence. Detachment sequence, stage 1, emotional reduction. This is where the shift begins internally. Depth fades first, even if interaction continues. They stop sharing what matters on a personal level. Conversations remain, but emotional transparency decreases. What used to be open becomes measured, controlled, and selective. They are still present, but no longer fully accessible. Stage 2, cognitive detachment. Next, the mental connection begins to fade. You stop occupying their mental space in the same way. There is no longer overthinking, no internal replay, no analysis of interactions. Where there was once reflection, there is now neutrality. The mind no longer invests energy into interpretation because the need to understand starts dissolving. Silence becomes normal, not confusing. Stage 3, behavioral distance. Finally, behavior aligns with internal withdrawal. Communication becomes minimal and functional. Emotional tone flattens. Presence becomes optional rather than intentional. They still respond, but without attachment behind the response. Now here's what makes this powerful. This entire process happens while they are still physically present in your life. That's why it goes unnoticed. Because externally, nothing seems fully broken. They are still there, still responding, still visible, but internally, access has already been restricted. And once emotional access is removed, the connection loses its influence completely. No arguments are required. No confrontation is necessary. No closure is demanded, because by the time physical distance appears, the psychological exit has already been completed long ago. When an empath fully disconnects, they don't just leave a person, they leave a version of themselves. This is where most people misunderstand the depth of the shift. Identity shift principle. The version that once existed in that connection was built on overextension of emotional capacity, a version that overgave, overexplained, overextended, a version that prioritized understanding over boundaries, connection over self-preservation, and emotional harmony over internal balance. But that version no longer exists. And this is critical because the separation is not only external, it is internal restructuring. Once that shift happens, the mind does not return to its previous configuration because going back would require re-entering an identity they have already outgrown. And once growth happens, regression feels unnatural. Empaths don't avoid returning out of ego, resentment, or pride. They avoid it because it no longer aligns with who they have become. The clarity they reached cannot be undone. The patterns they saw cannot be unseen. And once perception changes at that level, emotional memory no longer dictates behavior the same way. So even if the situation reappears, even if familiarity returns, even if emotional echoes remain, their perception has already shifted permanently. And perception controls connection. This is why their absence feels final, not because they are holding on to emotion, but because they have moved beyond the version of reality where that connection still fit. And when someone outgrows a dynamic internally, returning is no longer a question of feeling. It becomes a question of identity consistency, and that is where the return ends before it ever begins. Here's the truth most people realize too late. Empaths don't lose power when they disconnect, they reclaim it. Because what looks like loss from the outside is actually internal redistribution of energy, attention, and focus. Power reversal law. While they are emotionally invested, their attention is constantly outward, focused on understanding others, maintaining balance, and sustaining connection even at personal cost. Their awareness is directed toward emotional states of others, subtle shifts in behavior, maintaining relational stability. But the moment detachment begins, that entire system reverses. Their attention returns inward, and that shift changes everything, because control only exists where emotional access exists. Once that access is removed, the leverage disappears with it. No more emotional entry points, no more reactive triggers, no more influence through inconsistency. They stop seeking validation externally, needing explanations for clarity, reacting to unstable behavior patterns. And in that state, they become untouchable, not emotionally cold, not detached from feeling, but internally complete, self-regulated, self-contained, and no longer externally dependent for emotional balance. That's why their disappearance feels so final, because it is not a reaction to pain. It is the result of resolution, not chaos, not conflict, but clarity that has fully settled. And when an empath reaches that point, they don't argue, they don't explain, they don't negotiate emotional space anymore. They simply exit the dynamic internally first, and then externally follow through. No return needed, no closure required. They quietly disappear forever.